He clutched a vial of poison in his trembling hand, ready to choose death over any other fate. In the year 65, the Roman Empire was shaken by yet another scandalous piece of news. The Praetorian Guard had found him in an abandoned winery on the outskirts of the Eternal City, locked in a dilapidated cellar where, barely 20 years old, he held a deadly poison in his mouth. This was no ordinary criminal or political rebel. Standing before the soldiers was Sporus, a young man who had once been married to Nero as the Empress of Rome. He preferred to end his life rather than face the new emperor's crusade of revenge in the arena of the Colosseum. But to understand why death seemed to him the only salvation, we must go back 3 years to the year 62, when the half-mad Nero, who ruled the empire, first saw a boy with eyes exactly like those of his dead wife. The story of Sporus is not just another example of Roman excess. It is the most terrifying case of identity theft in human history, when a criminal discarded one life in order to recreate another with a scalpel, an intrigue. And all of this is documented in the emperor's official records. In the year 61, something happened that turned Nero's world upside down. Poppaea Sabina, his muse and the most perfect of women, died in his private chambers. According to Tacitus and Suetonius, Nero literally crushed her stomach with one powerful kick. Poppaea died in an unfortunate accident while pregnant. Other chronicles mention a brutal beating, which left bruises on the marble floor that did not fade for a long time, and Nero, left alone with the horror of what he had done, gasped and sent for doctors. Even for the divine emperor, death was a final sentence. Poppaea Sabina came from a plebeian family, but her beauty and charm rivaled that of the goddesses. Her amber hair shimmered in the sun, her skin seemed to glow, and her large, dark eyes gave her the appearance of Venus. Nero sang her praises in his poems, threw lavish parties for her, and even had rare floral elixirs brought from Alexandria, so that the fragrance of her toilet would rival the scent of the gardens of the 7 hills. But Poppaea's death was a personal insult to the emperor. When you are used to the whole world serving your whims, when you have been taught since childhood that you are a descendant of the gods, death itself is perceived as a challenge. Nero refused the traditional cremation pyre, instead ordering his wife's body to be embalmed with incense from all over the Arabian Peninsula and Egypt. She was dressed in purple silk and placed in a crystal sarcophagus set up in the chess hall of the palace. Servants said that the emperor often engaged in dialogues with the dead body, set a table for it, and read reports from the prefects. The palace doctors, risking falling out of favor, tried to convince him of the naturalness of grief, but they saw that the ruler's soul was falling apart. He brightened his sleepless nights with wine made from poppy juice, greeted the morning with cries of "Poppaea," and hurried to her chambers, where everything, down to the last hairbrush, remained untouched. He ordered that her wardrobe, her mannerisms, even her manicure be reproduced in the smallest detail. After a couple of months, mysterious visions began. He saw Poppaea in every other face. She flashed before him in the crowd at the forums, at the gladiator games, and in the guise of a prostitute in one of the neighborhoods. The emperor grabbed other women by the face, turned them toward the light, trying to find the one mole. Such eccentric behavior alarmed the entire aristocracy, but nothing could quell Nero's obsession. He gathered the best sculptors and artists in Rome and demanded that they capture not only Poppaea's appearance, but also her spirit. When the statues turned out lifeless, the masters were beaten or thrown out of the palace. At the same time, the head of the court scriptorium discovered a mention in the archives of a boy from the eastern provinces who had the same eyes, large, dark, emphasized by a frightening grandeur of gaze. The boy had once been a slave, but he was freed, and given the name Sporus. His youth and serenity captivated the emperor more than any living creature. On the solemn day when Nero met the newly appointed officials, the 15-year-old Sporus was brought into the hall. According to legend, when the nobles unrolled the scrolls, the emperor looked at the young man and froze. Standing before him was the exact double of Poppaea. Inflamed by the illusion of resurrection, Nero ordered the boy's head to be shaved, castrated, and then dressed as an empress. He adorned him with a diadem, dressed him in purple, and ordered him to be taught the manners and speech that had once been characteristic of his beloved wife. Thus, Sporus rose to the status of empress at court for the first time. This horrific ritual of loading the dead image of a woman into the flesh of a young man lasted 3 years. He was locked in luxurious chambers, surrounded by court ladies, responded to court intrigues, and even became a participant in secret councils with the emperor. Only Sporus himself, according to the testimony of sailors and guards, understood the game being played and tried to escape, unsuccessfully. When, 3 years later, the new emperor who came after Nero learned of Sporus's fall into the abyss of Roman palace madness, he made a decision. Keeping him alive was more dangerous than any intrigue. And so, at the bottom of an abandoned villa, where the basement was dusty and the air was thin, they found a young man with a cup of poison. But the authorities could only take him to court. No death could erase the nightmare he had gone through and the life that had been taken from him. No one expected the emperor's madness to play on the edge of cruelty like a violin. A single glance from Nero could melt steel, and now he had found a new target for his twisted fantasies. Nero jumped up from his throne so abruptly that he scattered scrolls across the marble floor. A deathly silence fell over the hall as the emperor slowly approached the trembling boy, like a cat stalking its prey. His gaze revealed not only rage, but also a mad hope that was terrifying in its intensity. Nero's voice sounded strained, quiet, almost a whisper, as he asked the teenager his name. The boy muttered that his name was Sporus, and that he was the obedient divine Augustus. Here it is worth taking a step back and remembering that Sporus was no ordinary slave. He was born into the imperial family. His mother, a German woman captured at the border, died in childbirth, and the boy grew up in the labyrinthine chambers of the court known as the imperial family, Familia Caesaris. There, together with the children of freedmen, he was taught ancient Greek and Latin rhetoric, given the basics of arithmetic, and introduced to the works of Homer and Cicero. His handsome features and sharp mind made him perfect for writing and studying, not hard labor. But none of that mattered in that fateful moment. Sporus stopped being a person and became a canvas for the emperor's crazy vision. According to eyewitnesses, the thorough examination lasted forever, although in reality it only took a few minutes. Nero touched the boy's face with all his fingers, turned it in the light of oil lamps, ran his fingers through his curly, dark hair, like an artist looking for the perfect curve of a stroke. Sporus stood motionless, realizing that his life was hanging by a thread, but not fully aware of the scale of the tragedy that was about to unfold. Finally, Nero stepped back. According to one chronicler, a smile spread across his lips, like that of a man who had discovered the secret of victory over death. The emperor ordered all other audiences to be postponed and summoned the best doctors to prepare the finest chambers and the sharpest instruments, words that sounded like a death sentence in the hall. While the surgeons prepared their scalpels and bandages, Nero had only one thing to do: study the object of his obsession. For several days, Sporus was kept in luxurious apartments next to the emperor's chambers. He was measured with a compass. His body proportions were calculated and compared with those of Poppaea Sabina, Nero's deceased wife. Nero gathered artists at court who had worked on the empress's portrait and ordered them to sketch Sporus from every possible angle. He studied these sketches with the same fervor with which a scholar peers at an ancient manuscript, making half-erased notes and marking which areas needed improvement. But his analysis was not limited to appearance. Every day, Nero forced Sporus to recite words for hours, correcting his intonation and teaching him the subtleties of the Poppaean manner, the strict elongation of vowels, the smooth gait, the gentle gestures of the hands. Wherever the boy went, he was accompanied by an invisible shadow of manners that he had not chosen but could not escape. The psychological pressure quickly turned into outright torture. Forbidding anyone to call the boy by his name, the emperor ordered that Sporus be addressed as "my lady" and "madam." Simple tunics were replaced by open robes in warm shades, Poppaea's favorite colors. He was taught how to use cosmetics, not the light touches of a Roman youth, but heavy red blush and white powder, customary for the nobility. Imagine waking up every morning, looking into a polished bronze mirror and seeing your face gradually fade away, your personality evaporate. Keeping track of Sporus at every move was a task not only for artists, but also for court servants. Some remained at the doors of his chambers, ready at any moment to snatch the boy away at the slightest protest. But there was no struggle. A single extra word could result in execution or something worse. Nero spoke openly and enthusiastically about the upcoming operation. His personal physicians were ordered to prepare a procedure for castration and complex body reconstruction to achieve feminine forms. At that time, simple castration was used on stage performers and male singers. But this was a much more daring experiment, an attempt to create a woman from a man. The doctors, tormented by threats of death and tempted by huge rewards, developed a plan that was much more extensive than the usual removal of male organs. The emperor wanted to see an exact copy of Poppaea in Sporus. On the eve of the operation, something symbolic happened. Nero looked into Sporus's rooms with a small wooden box containing a ring. It was Poppaea's engagement ring, a large emerald surrounded by pearls. The emperor placed the jewel on Sporus's ring finger, and it dangled there like a label of destiny. According to the courtiers, Nero said that tomorrow the boy would be reborn and become hers again. Imagine the whisper of a scalpel in the silence of the imperial palace and a scream echoing through the corridors, haughty horror disguised as love. Sporus, a young slave and once the favorite of Poppaea Sabina, barely managed to utter in the dim light, he was trembling with fear. "Will it hurt?" he asked in a barely audible voice. A barely perceptible doubt flashed across Nero's face, something almost human, but it immediately gave way to insane determination. He just smiled and said softly, "Birth is always accompanied by pain, but what is born will be beautiful." The operation took place in a specially equipped chamber in the medical wing on Palatine Hill. Under the arches covered with linen sheets, Greek doctors, led by the emperor's personal physician, worked for several hours straight. Thin iron scalpels cut through the flesh, and attempts were made to drown out Sporus's moans with supposedly soothing compresses mixed with poppy tincture. According to one chronicle, desperate cries could be heard in 3 corridors, despite the enormous thickness of the walls. Nero languished outside, pacing back and forth as if waiting at the door of a delivery room, and from time to time he called out loudly, "Hold on! It's almost ready!" as if his words could lessen the unbearable agony. The recovery took months. In an era without antibiotics, every early symptom of infection was life-threatening. Sporus had to be bathed daily in soapy water, his wounds washed, his bandages changed, and he had to take laxative opium decoctions to prevent sepsis. The emperor personally monitored the dosage of painkillers and carefully bandaged the former slave's hands himself, like an artist correcting every detail on his canvas. But all this care had a twisted meaning. Nero was not saving a man. He was creating an object for his fetishistic fantasies. His gestures were a mixture of desperate power and satirical love. At night, he read Poppaea's favorite poems aloud, recited excerpts from her diaries, demanding that Sporus absorb every intonation, every smile, and every tear that filled her life. When the wounds healed, the psychological reworking began. A veritable regimen of tutors descended on the palace with an entourage of Latin grammarians and Greek philosophers. Sporus learned to walk on the soft marble with small, swaying steps typical of a Roman matron, mastering pompous but precisely calibrated gestures. Under the watchful eye of master orators, he spent hours practicing raising his voice a semitone higher, producing a drawn-out feminine timbre. In the Empress's court workshop, seamstresses recreated exact copies of Poppaea Sabina's dresses, flowing woven panels of purple and cream silk trimmed with gold thread. Perfumes collected from frankincense and myrrh were carefully mixed according to recipes preserved in the palace archives so that the scent of Sabina would be absolutely identical. The morning rituals lasted for hours. Sporus' face was covered with a layer of white makeup, after which his hair was braided into intricate hairstyles, using beeswax, pins to weigh down the curls, and an army of slave hairdressers. He had to lie on special pillows, striking a pose expected of a lady of high society, and engage in casual conversation. Subtle, without wit, but sufficiently sharp. Nero did not limit himself to appearance and manners. Sporus was required to know Poppaea's biography in detail, from her childhood in Pompeii to her first marriage to Rufus and her rapid rise at court. He memorized the names of her friends, her favorite dishes, fresh figs and honey from the meadows of the Bernini Alps, as well as her taste in poetry, Ovid's elegies and Horace's harvests. When the emperor slyly recalled non-existent events in conversation, Sporus immediately responded with a phrase and voice that could have been recognized by the spirit of the late empress herself. 6 months after the operation, she made her first public appearance. In a modest courtyard at a table set with her closest senators and their wives, something supernatural happened. When Sporus, dressed in a royal purple toga and adorned with pearls and gold bracelets, entered the hall in the flickering light of oil lamps, the conversation stopped instantly. The glasses froze in midair. The guests, who had long heard whispers about the miracles of Nero's surgery, were stunned. In the fullness and tan of her skin, in her graceful movements and mysterious smile, they recognized Poppaea herself. Even the most discerning courtiers believed in the miracle for a moment. Before them stood Sabina, the new image of the emperor's beloved. Nero beamed like a sculptor presenting a finished statue for the first time. All evening he held her hand affectionately and introduced her. "Allow me to present my beloved Sabina." His voice rang with pride and possession, not a person but a trophy. But the deception did not last long. Gaius Tacitus, who published his annals years later, wrote that those who witnessed Sabina's birth were torn between horror and disgust. They noted that even after careful care, Sporus's hands remained slightly more massive than a woman's, and in some poses, his gaze betrayed his former status as a slave. Thus ended one of the darkest pages in Roman history, where imperial cruelty intertwined with perverted vanity, turning human life into a disgusting spectacle. Sporus forever became a living martyr of Nero's black love, the perfect embodiment of the illusions that the ruler of the world had created. Have you ever heard of a wedding that makes your blood run cold? In the year 67 AD, Nero held a celebration where, instead of Poppaea Sabina, the grim shadow of the young Sporus appeared. Not long ago, this boy was a free citizen, but after Poppaea's death, the emperor demanded that surgeons make him an exact copy of his late wife. Broad shoulders under flowing silk almost hid his masculine muscles, and Sporus's voice was muffled by trained, soft intonations. But sometimes, when he forgot himself, a trembling baritone broke through the feminine notes. In those moments, his real voice could be heard, full of sharp intelligence and dry humor, followed by a deep sadness that had nothing to do with the image of Poppaea. Ancient Roman historians, including Suetonius and Tacitus, mentioned such moments, but they were quickly crossed out. Any deviation from the role was punished by Nero's cold contempt, deprivation of affection, and the promise to find a more suitable Poppaea. When the emperor officially announced the wedding, even the hardened senators gasped. At the beginning of the 67th year, decrees were posted throughout Rome. Nero is marrying Sporus. The ceremony became a public holiday. Sacrifices were made to the gods in the temples on the Palatine Hill. Festival priests offered snow-white sacrificial lambs, and wedding planners studied centuries-old codes of marriage rites. Ivy and roses were hung along the main route of the procession, and the facades of the palaces on the Via Appia were decorated with purple banners. All senators, quaestors, and ambassadors from neighboring kingdoms received invitations. To refuse would have meant inviting suspicion of disloyalty. The wedding day itself turned into a spectacle of unprecedented scale. Sporus was dressed in a saffron bridal veil. His face was painted with traditional cosmetics, according to a recipe from Horace's Odes. A strip of scarlet ochre was applied to his forehead, and his eyelashes were tinted with ashes from Nero's flooded temple. The dowry, valued at hundreds of millions of sesterces, was transferred by formal contract: lands in Campania, villas in Latium, and dozens of servants and slaves. Just as in any imperial marriage, the legal documents were sealed with ancient Roman oaths. The banquet, which lasted 3 days, was more lavish than the Saturnalia. Whole cows were stuffed with peacocks, pheasant meat was served, and the finest wine from the emperor's amphorae flowed like a river. The poet Aelian composed an elegy in honor of the new Augusta, and the senators were forced to sing dithyrambs to the beauty of Sporus, although everyone understood the absurdity of what was happening. Golden diadems, black obsidian mirrors, and amulets depicting Venus were brought as gifts, mixing prayers for fertility with mockery of the natural order. But the real punishment took place behind the palace walls and never ended. In the mornings, Sporus would wake up in the chambers where Poppaea had once lived, put on her telescopic jewelry, have his servants comb his hair like a doll's, and learn to copy every mannerism of his dead wife. In public, he always sat in the imperial box at the Colosseum, was carried through the streets in a wedding palanquin, and was honored by the Augusti. Crowds of Romans, always hungry for spectacle, whispered about the bridegroom without a sex, and peeked at him surreptitiously. During a tour of Greece in the year 67, the madness reached its peak. At the Olympic Games, Sporus took part in religious rituals with the priests of Zeus, was among those who crowned the victors, and even sat safely on the tribunal, accepting libations, offerings for the health of the emperor and empress. In the Peloponnese, the local elites bowed down before this farce as if before Nero's real wife. But what was truly terrifying was not the glitz of weddings and feasts, but the private evenings when the emperor demanded that Sporus not only provide a female body, but also reproduce the emotional nuances of the deceased Poppaea. Her favorite jokes, touches, intonations. The boy became a living ghost, a carrier of someone else's memories, broken at the whim of a tyrant. This story is a grim episode in the struggle for power over human dignity and proof of how far tyranny can go when its bearer has unlimited power. Did you know that a single human life can turn into a farce of palace intrigues and the doomed ravings of an emperor? Nero turned Sporus into a tortured puppet. No wonder that the slightest deviation from his role could spell disaster for him. If Poppaea deviated even slightly from the image of the deceased Poppaea, Nero would fall into a rage, then into icy disappointment, which was more terrifying to Sporus than death itself. After all, his only hope for life was to constantly please the ruler, torn apart by madness. The courtiers shifted uneasily at the sight of Poppaea, sometimes with fear, sometimes with pity, sometimes with disgust. Sporus found himself in an almost ghostly position, neither man nor woman, neither slave nor free, neither alive nor the person he once was. The palace servants whispered that they had seen him at dawn in the imperial garden, motionless, as if he had forgotten how to breathe when he was not playing his role. Historians such as Tacitus and Suetonius mentioned that Sporus was probably no more than 14 years old when Nero forced him to transform himself. He was a teenager, emaciated and frightened, surrounded by jewels and purple fabrics that stood out from the crowd like a brand. Attempts to escape inevitably ended in failure. Some were captured and chained, while those convicted of conspiracy were crucified in the palace courtyard, in full view of Sporus from the window of his chambers. Imagine the boy's trembling hands watching the pierced crosses rise above the dark stone of the courtyard. No one could hide. His disguise, his women's clothing, his laurel wreaths, and the yellow topazes on his waist gave him away immediately. But the most hateful moments were when Nero showed his true affection. The madman seemed to believe that he had resurrected Poppaea and showered his wife with gifts, pearls, fragrant oils, and skillfully crafted statuettes. He talked to him for hours, as if there really was intimacy between them. From the outside, it looked like idle, but what kind of love can there be where one soul is completely remade and a fragile body is forcibly molded to the fantasy of another? Soon, Sporus developed what modern psychiatry would call severe dissociative disorder. He talked to mirrors, answered himself in a girlish voice, and called himself Poppaea even when Nero was not around. The servants pitied his mental breakdown. It seemed that the line between Sporus and his role had been completely erased. In the spring of 68 AD, Rome itself was in turmoil. There were uprisings in the provinces. The Senate declared Nero an enemy of the state, and the Praetorian Guard turned against him. The emperor, accompanied by a few loyal servants and Sporus, fled the city. In those last days in a villa outside the city, Nero's madness reached its peak. He alternated between grandiose plans for escape and theatrical preparations for suicide. Through it all, Poppaea remained by his side. The emperor's devoted wife as a vast empire collapsed. When surrender was imminent, Nero demanded that Sporus beg him with tears, as if he were Poppaea. "My only love, my resurrection," he begged, ready to die together like the ancient heroes of tragedy. And when Nero plunged a dagger into his throat, guiding the blade with a trembling hand, Sporus performed his last act of mercy. He helped to guide the blade. Nero's death should have freed his captive, but instead a new nightmare began. Sporus became a trophy, a living symbol of the late emperor's madness and extravagance, which could not be parted with. The first to visit him was Galba, an old general who had briefly worn the purple. He kept Sabina in the imperial palace, but showed no interest in him. For 7 months, Sporus lived in the semi-darkness of the courtyard, still dressed in women's clothes, but without his former enthusiasm. When Galba was killed in the Forum, Otho, the former husband of the real Poppaea, came to power. Seeing in Sporus the image of his treacherously taken wife, he cherished a terrible dream of revenge for Nero's crimes. Sources say that Otho treated him like a real widow, promising marriage, but his reign lasted only 2 months. After committing suicide, Otho handed Sporus over to the victorious Vitellius. It was under Vitellius that Poppaea experienced the most diabolical chapter of her fate. The new emperor was ill-mannered and gluttonous, and did not gravitate toward the sophisticated cruelty of his predecessors. For him, Sporus was not a human being, but a living curiosity for the crowd. According to legend, when Vitellius entertained guests at the circus, the younger Empress had to go out to the laughter and vegetable-throwing crowd, demonstrating the insane ravings of his rule. Thus ended the horrific story of a man whose only crime was to be too similar to the favorite troupe of a mad emperor. In the darkness of the Colosseum, the most terrifying spectacle of the Roman Empire was about to unfold. A young man whose life was already a tragedy was to become the main character in a story of violence and death. In the year 69 AD, when Rome was experiencing the Year of the Four Emperors, Aulus Vitellius ascended the throne. He announced that Sporus, Nero's former favorite, a young man of about 20 years of age, would take part in public games, not in the imperial box, but in the very heart of the arena. The plan was diabolical. Sporus would be forced to reenact the myth of Proserpina, daughter of the goddess Ceres, who was kidnapped by Pluto and taken to the underworld. In this fateful performance, gladiators dressed as demons would snatch him from the crowd, rape him in front of thousands of spectators, and then kill him. The Romans were accustomed to bloody spectacles, but this cruelty exceeded all bounds. Upon learning of his sentence, Sporus finally found the strength he had lacked for so long. Instead of submitting to the ultimate humiliation, he chose death on his own terms. According to various reports, some historians say that he took poison, while others believe that he cut his own veins, as tragic heroes did in ancient legends. But all sources agree. He took his own life and did not live to see his 21st birthday. His story raises eternal questions about personality and free will under absolute power. Sporus was systematically broken and remolded for the sake of someone else's illusion. He was physically castrated. According to some accounts, surgeons cut off part of his body to make him look like the murdered Poppaea. Psychologically and socially, he was forced to take on a foreign role and name. Perhaps Speranza or Proserpina were nothing more than mockery. We still do not know who he was before he met Nero. His dreams, habits, and true voice are lost forever. One thing is clear: this young man became a living ghost, forced to pretend to be someone he was not. Researchers argue, did Sporus ever resist his captivity? Some point to his suicide as the only act of true freedom, while others note minor acts of disobedience, an attempt to escape, the moment when he almost tore off the mask of his infernal performance. But perhaps even more terrifying is the widespread complicity. The surgeons who prepared him for the game, the teachers who taught him manners, the courtiers who gossiped about him, the hundreds of servants who dressed him in a different outfit every morning. All of them chose their own safety over the humanity of a young man. The story of Sporus reminds us that power without conscience breeds unimaginable horrors. When reality itself is subject to the whims of the powerful, when people become raw material for the fantasies of others, tragedy is inevitable. In the ruins of Nero's palace in Rome, you can still walk through the corridors where Sporus lived, look into the halls where he tried on the image of a foreign goddess, and heard his own footsteps in a foreign voice. It is there, among the ruins, that his forced performance ends and his long-awaited peace begins. The stones remember, even though history has long since erased the name of the boy who was doomed to wander as a ghost.